Hi, my name is Kellen. I'm a junior at Stanford studying human biology and computer science. And I want to start my talk today by asking you all a question. Take a moment and ask yourself, can you name any of the service workers who work at your school? For instance, it could be one of the dining staff at your cafeteria or one of the landscaping staff who works on your campus. What about the name of the person who cleans your floor in the dorms? If you can't think of anyone, you're probably not alone. In fact, if you'd asked me this question back in freshman year, I wouldn't have been able to name a single person. But for me, that all changed when I joined a club at Stanford called ABLA. You see, ABLA is a student-run organization whose mission is to teach English to Hispanic service workers on campus. And the way we do this is we match students with workers for one-on-one language coaching. Ultimately, our goal is to build a community of students and workers and to give workers the language skills that they need to achieve their goals. So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about some of my experiences with service workers, both inside and outside of ABLA. And by the end of this talk, I hope to convince you that despite the language barrier, despite the awkwardness, despite whatever obstacles there may be, it really pays off to reach out to the service workers in your community and develop relationships with them. Now, you might be wondering why I decided to join ABLA in the first place. And to answer that, I want to talk a little bit about my background. So I was born in Phoenix, Arizona. And growing up, I was always surrounded by different languages. Both of my parents are from Vietnam, so I grew up in what you might call a bilingual household, which really just means that my mom would speak to me in Vietnamese and I would reply in English. Now, I also lived in an area that had a pretty large Hispanic population, so I was surrounded by a lot of Spanish. In fact, my elementary school had Spanish as a required class, so I started taking Spanish classes when I was about 5 years old. And growing up surrounded by all these languages really gave me an appreciation for how meaningful it is to be able to talk to someone in their native tongue. And especially how meaningful it is to service workers to be able to break through the language barrier just to talk to them. One of the first times this really clicked for me was back in high school. It started when my school threw a trivia contest, and one of the questions was, what is the name of the person who serves lunch every day? And no one in my class knew his name. That really struck me because this was someone who we all interacted with pretty much every day, and yet none of us knew his name. So the next day, while I was waiting in line for lunch, I decided to take some initiative, and I asked for his name. He told me that his name was Donovan. And from that day onward, whenever I got lunch, Donovan and I would make a little bit of small talk, sometimes in English, sometimes in Spanish. And over time, I got to know a lot more about Donovan. For instance, I learned that his family was originally part of a Native American tribe. I learned that in his free time, he volunteered at a homeless shelter. Not only that, but over the next 4 years, we also got to celebrate a lot of milestones together. He was one of the first people who congratulated me when I got into Stanford, and I was able to congratulate him when his daughter got married. On the last day of 12th grade, I asked Donovan to sign my yearbook, and he wrote this very sweet message to me. Now, whenever I read this message, it reminds me of how grateful I am for our relationship and how this connection never would have been possible if I hadn't taken the initiative on that first day to ask for his name. Now let's fast forward to college. During my first week at Stanford, there was a club fair, and that's when I came across ABLA. Immediately, I knew that this was an organization worth investing my time into. It was an opportunity for me to connect with an underserved community while also putting my Spanish-speaking skills to use. So as soon as I could, I signed up for ABLA, took the training courses, and soon I was paired with a worker named Lucy. Lucy was a custodial worker who worked in the campus library. The first day I met Lucy was in January of 2020. We met in the library, and she guided me to the janitor's closet, which was this narrow room full of cleaning supplies. And at one end of the room, there was a little desk where she had set up 2 chairs, one for her and one for me. So we sat down, went through introductions, and talked about our goals. From then on, I met Lucy 1 hour per week to teach her English. One of her main goals was to be able to communicate better with students. You see, sometimes a student would come up to her in the library and ask for directions, and she wasn't really confident enough in her English to give an answer. So with that in mind, I came up with some exercises and worksheets to help her become more confident in giving directions. Now, during these lessons, I also learned a lot about Lucy as a person. I learned that she immigrated from Mexico in the 90s. I learned that she has 3 daughters and a son. And I also learned that persimmons were her favorite fruit. You see, every time I visited her for a lesson, I noticed that she had a few persimmons lined up on her desk, and at the end of every session, she would offer one to me. So over the next few months, we made a lot of progress. Lucy was a fast learner, and it was so satisfying to see her face light up when a concept clicked. I remember one day, a few weeks into our lessons, I knocked on the door to the janitor's closet, and she opened the door with this huge smile on her face. And she told me that the other day, a student had asked her for directions to the nearest cafe, and she was able to answer in English with confidence. That was a huge accomplishment for both of us. So we decided to share some celebratory persimmons together. And to this day, that is one of my favorite memories from Habla. Now, so overall, things were going great. But then, as we all know, COVID hit. In March, Stanford kicked all of the students off campus, and Habla had to figure out how to adapt to the virtual setting. This was a really disruptive time for everyone, but especially so for the workers, because many of them were being laid off. There were moments when Habla members would try to reach out to their learners, and then the reply would be, unfortunately, I don't work at Stanford anymore. Seeing how tough of a time this was for everyone, I decided to step up my involvement in Habla by joining the leadership team as the Director of Communications and Marketing. My job was to facilitate communication between coaches and learners to ensure that everyone's needs were met. And then on the marketing side, I was also responsible for things like creating the website and designing materials to promote awareness about Habla to both students and workers. Now, one concern that we had when COVID hit was that the workers might not even be interested in English lessons anymore. We thought maybe they would have other priorities to deal with. But surprisingly, when I reached out to the workers, an overwhelming majority wanted to continue with Habla. And it turns out that English was a more valuable skill than ever during COVID, because they needed to do things like fill out forms, read information, and communicate with doctors and employers. And that's the moment when I realized how much of an impact Habla truly had on these workers. Because when a pandemic hit and they were at risk of losing their jobs, Habla was one of the few support networks that they had. So with this realization, we decided to do everything we could to build that support network. We translated resources about COVID. We partnered with organizations like Students for Workers' Rights. During the holidays, we recruited students both inside and outside of Habla to call workers on the phone and wish them well. And finally, we organized a letter writing campaign where over 100 students wrote personalized thank you notes to the workers. The response to our efforts was amazing. The workers were so pleased to see that students cared about them, especially during such a difficult time. Here's just one example of a message that we received in response to the letter writing campaign. Translated to English, it reads, "Thank you so much, truly. It makes me very happy to read these encouraging words, full of sincerity. I too am grateful for everything you do. It's not easy being a teacher, especially in these times." I'm telling you this story because I want to show you how much of an impact you can have on underserved communities using the skills that you develop through marketing. And no matter what field you go into, I hope that you can continue to support the workers in your community. The connections that I made with Donovan, Lucy, and some of the other workers in Habla are some of the most meaningful relationships I've made, and none of it would have been possible if I didn't make that first step of asking their name. With that being said, the next time you bump into a service worker that you see regularly on campus, go ahead and introduce yourself. Ask their name. To you, it might just be a little bit of small talk, but to them, it could be more meaningful than you think. That wraps up my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Feel free to connect with me on Instagram or LinkedIn, and I'm happy to take any questions.